Well, I want to welcome Ambassador Thomas Greminger to this edition of the Public Conversations for the Toda Peace Institute. Welcome, Thomas. Thomas Greminger joined the Swiss diplomatic service in 1990 and served in many different places, posts both in Bern, Tel Aviv, Geneva, Mozambique, and elsewhere, and then served as the deputy head and later head of the Human Security and Peace Policy Division, where he worked in Bern for several years. From 2010, Ambassador Greminger was the Swiss ambassador to the OSCE, the United Nations and International Organizations in Geneva. And during the Swiss chairmanship of the OSCE in 2014, he played a key role in establishing the observer mission in the Ukraine. In 2017, Ambassador Greminger was also designated Secretary General of the OSCE, where he served until 2020, giving him a privileged position and view on events in Ukraine and East Central Europe. Since 2021, we've been happy to welcome Ambassador Greminger back into Geneva, where he is now the Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and part of his role is promoting dialogue and cooperation and Track 2 diplomatic initiatives on various subjects, which I hope we'll be able to touch upon. Let me start with a very broad general question before we dive into some of the details. You can now look back on more than 30 years of a diplomatic career. And from today's vantage point, what are some of the major global shifts that you would say characterize the contemporary situation and characterize the last 30 years of global politics?
I was, lucky enough to start my diplomatic career at the end of history, when we came out of the Cold War in the early 90s. The situation was wide open. There was a strong belief, including by all major stakeholders in international cooperation. And I think that very much shaped the first, I would say, at least half of my career. Then depending a bit, do you look at the world and in particular at European security through the lens of a peace and peace and security, then of course I would say relatively early on, around the turn of the millennium, you felt that this spirit of the Charter for European Security started fading, that there was more and more polarization. Relations between Russia and the West started gradually turning sour. And I think from that moment on, we kind of were driven again, by the security dilemma in Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian security, and somehow didn't manage to get out of this trap. When it came to more broader issues, I would say this golden age of international cooperation lasted longer. I would say, if I recall the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016, the Sustainable Development Agenda in 2015, that I would say perhaps until the start, of the first Trump administration, there was this sense, that many of the global challenges, they would have to be addressed in international cooperation, and I think that spirit dominated a significant part of my diplomatic career. Now, obviously, we are in a totally different environment where geopolitical competition, rivalry prevails, where we clearly have entered into a multipolar world. that is still very chaotic, where we lack predictability, where we lack clear references in terms of international law, where it seems to have become fashionable again to change borders by military means, and where we see very few positively order-shaping powers around the globe.
So it's interesting that you make a distinction between the beginning of the chill, end of the honeymoon in the European context, which you trace to the early 2000s, and yet a continued positive environment in the multilateral arena up until perhaps a decade later. Is it just a situation where now the rest of the world is catching up to the European security dilemma, or are these two completely separate tracks? And can we perhaps view them in the future as being a bit separate with the rise of some of the non-traditional powers or other great powers such as China?
Perhaps, the sense of having to address these global challenges like climate change jointly prevailed for longer and became not so early victim of a renewed geopolitical rivalry. And I would also say, that the relation between, let's say, Russia and the West became much more challenging at an earlier stage when China was still hadn't really been perceived as a main rival. I do differentiate between security and perhaps more global political and also development related challenges, where I think international cooperation seem to have prevailed for much longer.
Mm-hmm. I'll try and come back to a couple of those themes at the very end, but let's do a somewhat deeper dive into, of course, one of the big headlines, which is the war in Ukraine. I should say, of course, it's not the only big headline, and you are intimately familiar with all of the other crisis hotspots, whether it's Gaza or Sudan or Yemen or Myanmar. But let's go into a bit more detail in the Ukraine, partly because I know that you are following this very closely and an expert on this, given your previous positions. And a couple of occasions, including, I think, as recently as last January 2024, you described the war as partly as a stalemate and war of attrition that was settling into a kind of a long frozen conflict in a certain sense. Do you still hold that view today? And how do you think the medium-term situation might evolve more or less on the battlefield? Because I think that will shape some of the broader political considerations.
I think fundamentally the situation hasn't changed on the battlefield. It's clearly still a war of attrition. You see very little movement. Yes, it's true there was in August the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region, but I think without really achieving the effect that Ukrainians wanted to achieve. Yes, there is a sense that the military momentum may slightly be on the Russian side. There is some advance in the Donbass, but it comes at extremely high human and material cost. So I think the bigger picture is still very much one of a war of attrition, and the images are still, very similar to images that we remember from World War I.
which is a very sobering thought, in fact, when you see again some of the pictures and images. I know that in a broader context, there are lots of reports that speak about the slow but accelerating bite of sanctions on the Russian economy, the dropping value of the ruble, the high inflation rate, and possible very big stresses in the economy. Um, the expression in French was "pas d'argent, pas des Suisses" at some point, and that if you don't have money, you can't afford to fight the war. And I'm wondering to what extent you think Russia is slowly being ground down on that front, on the sort of domestic economic and social front.
I think enlightened Russians are aware that their current model of fighting the current war economy is not a sustainable one. And in that sense, when you look into the medium and longer term, I think you can pretend that time is on the Russian side. In the short term, though, there is a different perception. Clearly, there is the perception that, yes, the military momentum is on our side. The economy is booming. In major cities, there is a total denial of the country being at war. So I think there is clearly no sense of urgency on the Russian side for the time being, while I think among the elite there is a sense that this cannot be a sustainable way of running the economy, running the country in a longer term perspective.
I'm only going to ask one more battlefield type military balance question, and it concerns a couple of the recent decisions to allow both, I think, the Americans, the British, and now the French to allow strikes using their weapons into Russian territory, although it appears with some limitations. Do you think this is going to have either a material or even perhaps psychological impact on the Russian side, and in which direction?
I'm not sure, that it will have a decisive impact. It is an understandable response to an escalation from the other side by bringing North Korean troops um, to the battle line. But I think we are still in an escalatory logic. So there is this tit for tat, and that always brings a risk of escalation, of inadvertent escalation. At the same time, I'm pretty sure that the rules defined by Americans and Brits for the use of these long-range weapons are such that the risk of escalation is limited, and from what we are hearing, it's limited to being used in the Kursk region. There remains, I think, a strong concern in both Washington and London, not to risk an escalation to a confrontation between NATO and Russia.
So, parallel to this, there are periodic calls, some louder than others, to start the beginning of a process of negotiation, whatever that might mean. And I use that term very, very delicately. And certainly calls for dialogue. And we saw this reflected in Olaf Scholz's phone call to Putin, which was the first one in, I think, a couple of years. Others argue that this is completely premature since Russian war aims have not changed, and certainly neither have Ukrainians. So what, in your view, would be some of the preconditions for it to be ripe for negotiations? Assuming you don't think that now is the right time.
But if we follow Bill Sartman's theory, then I think it's fair to argue that for both sides, this mutually hurting stalemate has not been reached yet, clearly, and so that is, I think, also why I would assume that we will see a continuation of high intensity warfare for quite a while to come. This said, there is clearly an awareness, an increasing awareness in the Ukrainian leadership that time is not on their side and that at some point they will have to negotiate. And there is, of course, also the assumption that President-elect Trump will much quicker than another US administration would have encouraged or even obliged President Zelensky to negotiate. So I think it is fair to assume that we would see some movement next year, perhaps even early next year. Difficult to say at this point, if on the Russian side there is also a sense of returning to the negotiation table. As seen from a Ukrainian perspective, clearly they would prefer to do that when the military momentum is more on their side, as it is currently the case. And I think that is even more important at the moment when there are solid security guarantees for Ukraine, and that would deter Russia from another attempt of aggressing Ukraine. I think that would make it also from a domestic point of view, would make it much easier for President Zelensky to return to the negotiation table.
There is, of course, great speculation about what Donald Trump might do as president. And I've heard competing views on this. But one of them is that he certainly likes to win in a bargaining situation. It just depends on what you can define as coming out ahead. And in that sense, what would it take for Donald Trump or for the American administration to want to avoid an Afghanistan type catastrophe where strong support had been provided to a friendly state that essentially collapsed? And I think that might be at least the scenario that will cross the minds of some of the people in the administration.
Absolutely, and this is also an argument that I would use. While there is an assumption that President Trump would probably rather sooner than later oblige the Ukrainian government to negotiate, President Trump would want to look like a good deal maker in all of this. And I think here, we have not a very clear sense of what for him a good deal would look like. I think what is for sure, it would have to be perceived acceptable by the Ukrainians themselves. And that would probably imply that Ukraine can preserve its statehood, its independence, its Western European course. And as I said before, it would probably, it would for sure be built on strong security guarantees. And that is, of course, a question how they could look like. When it comes to the territorial question, I think the Ukrainian side would definitely insist that any freezing of the the current line of contact would only be of temporary nature and not a final. That is for sure. And also other issues, related to, let's say, sanction relief, reparations, war crime accountability, all this, would at least remain on the table for the foreseeable future. Even though you might see a cessation of hostilities that is simply building on a negotiated ceasefire, but not addressing all these other settlement-related issues at the same time.
So this sounds like a recipe for a Korea type situation, which of course is one that could last for a very long time.